The rental car's engine ticked as it cooled in the driveway. Camden Holt sat behind the wheel, staring at his house. Something was wrong. The front door was painted forest green now, not the weathered oak he'd stained himself 3 years ago. A silver pickup truck sat where his workshop space used to be. The flower beds he'd built from railroad ties were gone, replaced with decorative stones arranged in perfect circles. Camden killed the engine and stepped out. 7 months of Turkish dust and earthquake debris had left him lean and weathered, his hands scarred from moving concrete blocks and twisted rebar. His work boots hit the concrete he'd poured with his own hands 3 summers ago, mixing each batch himself to get the texture right. The familiar sound should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt foreign now that he walked to the front door, noting details that were wrong. The brass house numbers he'd mounted were gone, replaced with modern steel ones. The porch light fixture was different, cheaper. Even the doormat was new, some generic welcome message instead of the plain brown one he'd chosen. Camden pulled out his keys, the metal worn from his pocket. The deadbolt he'd installed with his own hands wouldn't turn. He tried again, applying more pressure, checking to make sure he had the right key. Nothing. The key slid in, but wouldn't engage. He examined the lock more closely. Same brand, same model, but the cylinder was different. Someone had changed the locks. The door opened from inside. The man Camden had never seen before stood in the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of gym-built physique that spoke of vanity rather than practical strength. He wore a gray hoodie Camden recognized as his own, the one he'd bought at a hardware store and spoken 5 years ago, soft from years of weekend projects. The stranger's eyes swept over Camden with casual dismissal, taking in the travel-worn clothes and the exhaustion that came from 36 hours of flights and connections. "You got the wrong place, man." Camden's voice came out flat and cold, the tone he'd used when talking to suspected insurgents in Afghanistan. "No, I don't. This is my home." The stranger, Asher, though Camden didn't know his name, yet stepped forward, filling the doorway with the kind of aggressive posture men used when they wanted to establish dominance without throwing the first punch. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to leave. Now." Camden didn't step back. He'd learned a long time ago that showing weakness invited escalation. "Where's Lorraine?" Asher's expression shifted from dismissive to wary. His hand moved to his phone, fingers already moving to unlock the screen. "How do you know that name?" "Because she's my wife." "Your wife?" Asher laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was sharp, defensive. "Buddy, I think you're confused. Lorraine's been with me for months. Her ex took off overseas and never came back. Left her with bills and a kid to take care of." Camden studied the man's face, noting the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned the overseas work. "What did she tell you about me?" "That you were a coward who couldn't handle responsibility. That you ran off to play soldier and never looked back." The words hit Camden like small caliber rounds, sharp, precise, designed to wound. But he'd been shot at by people who meant to kill him. Insults from a stranger wearing his clothes barely registered. She lied. Camden felt something cold settle in his chest. Not panic, not surprise, just a terrible, familiar clarity that came when explosives were involved and every wire mattered. "Get Lorraine. Now." Asher was already dialing. "Yeah, I need police at 247 Maple Street. Some guy's here claiming to be Lorraine's husband. Says he lives here." He paused, studying Camden. "He looks pretty unstable." Camden didn't move. He kept his hands visible, his stance relaxed. In the Army, he learned that the first person to escalate usually lost. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up. Camden recognized one of the officers, Mike Torres, who'd helped him with permits when he'd built the deck. "Camden." Torres stepped out, hand resting on his radio. "What's going on here?" "I've been overseas for work. I came home to find strangers in my house." Asher spoke up from the doorway. "This guy's been gone for months." Lorraine filed a missing person report. She had to move on with her life. That's when Camden saw her. Lorraine appeared behind Asher, her auburn hair shorter than he remembered, styled in a way that made her look older. She wore a blue dress he'd never seen, one that probably cost more than he'd made in a month overseas. She looked at Camden without expression. No surprise, no guilt, nothing. "He's dangerous," she said, her voice steady. He's been gone for months. He was declared missing. Torres looked between them. Camden, do you have any documentation? Lease deed, anything? Camden reached slowly for his wallet. My name's on the deed. I built this house. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back, the second officer said. Ma'am, do you have any documentation of residence? Lorraine disappeared inside and returned with a folder. Here's the lease agreement. Court documents from the divorce proceedings. And the missing person report I filed 6 months ago. Camden watched her hand over papers with his name on them, documents he'd never seen before. The officers examined them while Asher kept one hand on Lorraine's shoulder, a gesture that was more possessive than protective. Mr. Holt, Torres said finally, I'm sorry, but according to these documents, you've been declared legally missing. The residence has been transferred. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property. Those are forgeries. Sir, if you believe there's been fraud, you'll need to take that up with a lawyer. Right now, these are the only legal documents we have. Camden looked at Lorraine one more time. She met his eyes without flinching, and in that moment, he saw something that surprised him. She wasn't afraid. She was proud. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, Torres said. Camden complied. The handcuffs clicked shut with mechanical precision. As Torres led him to the patrol car, Camden heard Asher's voice behind him. Should have stayed wherever you went, man. Camden said nothing. He was already planning to AT the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. The smell of disinfectant and burnt coffee hit Camden like a physical reminder of every military base he'd ever been processed through. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in the harsh white glow that seemed designed to make people look guilty. Camden sat in a plastic chair across from Detective Ray Kowalski, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and the kind of mustache that had been popular in the 80s. The detective's desk was cluttered with case files, coffee cups, and a half-eaten sandwich that looked like it had been forgotten sometime around lunch. Says here your wife filed a missing person report on you 6 months ago, Kowalski said, flipping through a manila folder thick with paperwork. Used that to file for divorce in Stevens County. Quiet proceedings. Court tried to serve you multiple times. You never responded to any notices. Camden kept his voice level, the same tone he'd used when reporting to superior officers who'd already made up their minds. Because I never received them. Address on file shows a P.O. box in Coeur d'Alene. That rang a bell. Camden leaned forward slightly, studying the paperwork Kowalski held. I've never lived in Coeur d'Alene. Never rented a P.O. box there. Kowalski shrugged with the practiced indifference of a man who'd heard every excuse in the book. Well, somebody signed for the papers. Got a signature here that matches your driver's license on file. He slid a document across the table. The paper creased from multiple handlings. Camden studied the signature carefully. At first glance, it looked right. The sharp angles of the H, but Camden had been signing his name for 38 years, and he knew his own handwriting better than anyone. That's not my signature. Courts thought it was good enough. Kowalski leaned back in his chair, which squeaked under his weight. Look, Mr. Holt, I've seen this before. Couple has problems. One person takes off for months at a time. The other person gets tired of waiting around. It's not pretty, but it's not criminal either. Camden thought about the earthquake sites in Turkey, the weeks spent moving debris and searching for survivors. The work had been brutal 16-hour days in heat that could kill you, breathing dust that turned your lungs into sandpaper. But it was honest work, the kind that mattered. Run my ID. Kowalski sighed, but turned to his computer. His fingers tapped the keyboard with the hunt and peck method of someone who'd learned computers late in life. The screen flickered, displaying information that made his expression change from bored annoyance to genuine confusion. Huh, that's interesting. What? Your driver's license is flagged. Says here you're supposed to be missing. Missing person case opened 6 months ago, still active. Kowalski looked up from the screen. Also says your bank accounts have been frozen pending resolution of estate proceedings. Camden felt the walls closing in, but his voice stayed calm. Years of defusing explosives had taught him that panic was the enemy of clear thinking. Estate proceedings? Yeah. Says here you were declared legally dead 3 months ago. Absence exceeding 6 months with no contact, no response to official notices. Kowalski whistled low. Somebody really wanted you gone, didn't they? Camden thought about the house he'd built with his own hands. The mortgage he'd paid down to nothing. The savings account he'd been building for 7 years. I was working in Turkey. Earthquake recovery. I can prove it. I'm sure you can. But right now, legally speaking, you don't exist. Kowalski closed the folder. You get one phone call. I'd use it wisely. Camden dialed from memory. Jules answered on the second ring. Reddit Custom Woodworking. Jules. It's Camden. A pause. Jesus Christ. Where the hell have you been? Lorraine said you disappeared. I need you to pick me up. County lockup, downtown. What? What happened? I'll explain when you get here. Another pause. On my way. The rental truck's engine ticked as it cooled in the gravel driveway of Jules Reddick's workshop. Camden sat in the passenger seat, staring through the windshield at the organized chaos of lumber stacks and half-finished furniture that represented his oldest friend's life's work. Jules emerged from the workshop wiping sawdust from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. He was shorter than Camden, but built like a tree stump, with the kind of practical strength that came from years of working with hand tools. His beard was grayer than Camden remembered, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of too much squinting at detailed joinery work. They'd served together in Afghanistan, two engineers whose job had been to make deadly things safe. Jules had gotten out after his first tour and never looked back. Camden had stayed for 3, chasing something he'd never quite been able to name. Jesus Christ, Camden. You look like hell. Feel worse. Jules pulled 2 containers of Chinese takeout from a paper bag and gestured toward the tailgate of his pickup truck. They sat in familiar silence for a moment, the kind of quiet that came between men who'd shared enough danger to trust each other completely. So let me get this straight, Jules said finally, stabbing his low mane with a plastic fork like he was attacking it. You come home from 7 months in Turkey, and your wife has moved another man into your house. The house you built with your own hands. Using your tools. That's right. And she's got legal papers saying you're dead. Camden nodded, chewing mechanically. The food tasted like cardboard, but he needed the calories. He'd lost weight in Turkey, working 16-hour days in heat that sucked the life out of everything. And you didn't know any of this was happening. Communications were limited overseas. Spotty internet. I sent emails when I could, but responses were sporadic. Camden paused, thinking about the dozen unanswered messages he'd sent, the calls that had gone straight to voicemail. I thought she was just busy. Jules set down his container and studied Camden's face in the fading light. Camden, I gotta ask, and don't take this the wrong way. Were things bad between you two before you left? Camden considered the question. His marriage to Lorraine had never been what romance novels would call passionate. They'd been practical partners more than lovers. She'd wanted stability after growing up in foster care, bouncing between homes that treated her like a temporary inconvenience. He'd wanted someone who wouldn't leave when things got difficult. We weren't fighting, if that's what you mean. But you weren't exactly setting the world on fire either. No. Camden thought about their last conversation before he'd left for Turkey. She'd been polite, distant, wishing him well like he was an acquaintance heading off on vacation. She said the overseas work was good money. Said it would help us get ahead. Jules was quiet for a moment, processing information with the same careful methodology he applied to complex joinery. She came by the shop about 3 months ago. Asked if I'd heard from you. Said she was worried. What did you tell her? That you were fine. That overseas communications could be spotty, especially on disaster sites. Jules looked at him directly. She seemed relieved when I said that. Camden set down his food, the pieces starting to fit together in his mind like components of an explosive device. Each element was harmless on its own, but together they formed something designed to destroy. She wanted confirmation that communication was limited. Why would she want that? Camden thought about the forged signatures, the fake addresses, the careful timing of every legal filing. Because it gave her plausible deniability. If anyone asked why she couldn't reach me, she could point to people like you who confirmed that communication was difficult. Jules stared at him. You're saying she planned this from the beginning? I'm saying she's smarter than I gave her credit for. Camden pulled out the legal documents he'd photographed at the police station. Look at the timeline. Missing person report filed exactly 6 months after I left. Divorce papers filed in a different county using an address I've never lived at. Power of attorney documents signed with forged signatures. Jules examined the papers with the careful attention he usually reserved for blueprint measurements. This is comprehensive and patient. Camden, this is criminal fraud. Camden thought about Lorraine standing in the doorway of his house, calm and composed while he was arrested for trespassing. There had been something in her eyes that he'd missed in the moment, not guilt or fear, but satisfaction. She didn't beat me, he said finally. She got a head start. That's all. Jules watched him study the documents with the kind of focused intensity that had made Camden good at defusing bombs. What are you going to do? Camden didn't answer immediately. In Afghanistan, when they'd found an IED, the first rule was to understand exactly what you were dealing with before you started cutting wires. Rush the process, and you'd end up scattered across a landscape that didn't care about your good intentions. This was the same principle applied to civilian life. I'm going to prove she's a liar. Jules was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Camden had been expecting. And then what? Camden looked at his oldest friend, the man who trusted him to disarm explosives that could have killed them both. Jules deserved honesty. Then I'm going to destroy her. Savannah Holt lived in a suburb of Seattle, in a house that looked like it had been assembled from a catalog. Everything was clean, modern, and expensive. She answered the door in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger than 40 when she saw Camden standing on her porch. Her expression went through several emotions at once. Surprise, relief, then anger. You bastard. She tried to close the door. Camden put his boot against the frame. 5 minutes. You disappeared again. Just like after Dad died. Just like after you got back from Afghanistan. I didn't disappear. I was working for 7 months. Without calling, Camden pushed past her into the living room. Everything was white and gray, like a hotel room designed by someone who'd never lived anywhere warm. I called. I emailed. Did you get any of them? Savannah's anger faltered slightly. No, because Lorraine was intercepting everything. Camden sat down uninvited on her pristine couch. She filed a missing person report while I was still overseas. Used it to get power of attorney. Then she cleaned out our accounts and filed for divorce in a different county. Savannah remained standing, arms crossed. That's impossible. Is it? Camden pulled out his phone and showed her the photos of the legal documents. Look at the signatures. Look at the addresses. She took the phone reluctantly, squinting at the screen. Her expression changed as she scrolled through the images. This address on the divorce papers, I've never lived there, but I know this place. It's a mail forwarding service. Savannah looked up. I used them when I was between apartments. She used a fake address to file in a county where nobody would know us. Made it easier to get a quick approval. Savannah sank into the chair across from him. Camden, if this is true, it's true. Then we need to call the police. File fraud charges. Camden shook his head. Not yet. She's got a head start, but she made mistakes. I need to document everything first. Build a case that's bulletproof. What do you need from me? Camden looked at his sister. They'd never been close. Their father had been a drunk who died young, and their mother had checked out emotionally long before she died physically. Camden had left for the army at 18 and rarely looked back. Savannah had built a successful consulting business and a life that looked perfect from the outside, but she was still his sister. I need you to verify the document forgeries. You understand legal paperwork better than I do. Savannah was quiet for a long moment. There's one condition. What? No violence. If you want this clean, let's be better than them. Camden met her eyes. I never said anything about violence. You didn't have to. Jules' spare room was 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single window that looked out at the lumberyard. Camden had slept in worse places. The mattress was firm, the room was quiet, and it was free from the smell of lies. He'd been there a week when he started rebuilding his digital identity. The Spokane Public Library occupied a corner downtown that had seen better decades, its brick facade weathered by years of harsh winters and neglect. Camden had been there when they unlocked the doors at 9 o'clock sharp every morning for a week, laptop bag slung over his shoulder, looking like just another unemployed resident trying to stretch his internet access He'd claimed the same corner table each day, positioned away from the children's section, but with a clear view of the main entrance. Old habits from overseas work: always know your exits. Always watch who's coming and going. The laptop was old but functional, a machine he'd bought secondhand before deploying to Turkey. It ran slowly but reliably, like everything else Camden preferred to own. He learned a long time ago that fancy equipment was just another thing that could break when you needed it most. First, he documented everything with the methodical precision he'd once applied to explosive ordnance disposal. Every email he'd sent from Turkey that had gone unanswered. Every attempt at contact that had been met with silence. He pulled his credit reports, bank statements, employment records from the NGO that had contracted his services. The picture that emerged was systematic and methodical, like a demolition plan designed by someone who understood both patience and precision. Lorraine had started small, testing the boundaries like someone probing for weaknesses in a defensive perimeter. She'd change his mailing address first, redirecting everything to that P.O. box in Coeur d'Alene. The change had been subtle enough that Camden might not have noticed for months, especially if he'd been overseas. Then she'd stopped making mortgage payments on the house, forcing the bank to contact him at the new address. When those letters went unanswered because he never received them, she'd used his apparent abandonment to file for emergency financial powers. The IT was smart. It was patient, and it was completely illegal. Camden cross-referenced dates and signatures, building a timeline that revealed the careful orchestration behind what had looked like spontaneous desperation. She'd filed the missing person report exactly 6 months after he'd left for Turkey, the minimum time required to begin his state proceedings in Washington state. The divorce filing in Stevens County had come 2 weeks later, using an address Camden had never lived at and employment information that was completely fabricated. She'd listed him as a contractor for a construction company that didn't exist, working at a job site that had never been built. By the third day, Camden had something else that made his blood run cold. Bank records showed that Lorraine had been making purchases for home renovations while simultaneously claiming financial hardship in her court filings. She'd bought paint, new fixtures, and furniture while telling a judge that Camden's abandonment had left her unable to afford basic necessities. But the most damaging discovery came when Camden pulled property records from the county assessor's office. The house deed showed a transfer of ownership dated 3 months ago, executed through a power of attorney document that bore Camden's signature. Except Camden had never signed any power of attorney. The signature was close, but not perfect. Whoever had forged it was skilled, but they'd made the same mistake as the divorce papers. The C in Camden was too rounded, and the H in Holt slanted the wrong direction. Camden photographed everything, saved everything to multiple drives, and built a digital dossier that would be impossible to dispute. Each document was time-stamped. Each signature was analyzed. Each date was cross-referenced with his actual location and activities. By the end of the week, he had something that would have made his former commanding officers proud, a comprehensive intelligence package that laid out enemy capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Logical, Camden said to himself, staring at the timeline spreadsheet he'd created. But stupid. Lorraine had been thorough, but she'd also been overconfident. She'd assumed that Camden's absence would continue indefinitely, that he'd never return to challenge her carefully constructed narrative. She'd planned for a missing husband, not a living one with a habit of documenting everything and a professional background and making complex problems simple. She made the same mistake that insurgents in Afghanistan had made when planting roadside bombs. They'd focused so intently on the attack that they'd forgotten a plan for what happened when their target survived and started shooting back. Savannah called on a Thursday morning while Camden was reviewing bank records at the library. "I found problems," she said without preamble. "How many?" "Multiple irregularities. The deed transfer was notarized by someone who wasn't licensed to notarize in Washington. The divorce papers list an employment address for you that doesn't exist, and a signature on the power of attorney document." She paused. "It's not even close." Camden felt something loosen in his chest. "Will that hold up in court if we can prove fraud?" "Absolutely." "Camden, this is criminal. She didn't just take your house. She stole your identity. Can you document everything?" "I already am." I've got contacts in the county fraud office. People who owe me favors. Her voice was crisp, professional. But Camden, yeah, this goes through legal channels. No shortcuts. No vigilante justice. Camden thought about Lorraine standing in the doorway of his house, wearing a dress that cost more than his monthly salary overseas. She hadn't looked guilty. She'd looked victorious. Understood. I'm serious. If you do anything stupid, anything that compromises this case, I'll withdraw my help immediately. I said I understood. Savannah was quiet for a moment. There's something else. I pulled Emerson's school records. She enrolled him using your house as his primary address, but she also listed him as financially dependent on you for state benefit purposes. What does that mean? It means she's been collecting support payments in your name while simultaneously claiming you abandoned them. She's been double dipping. Camden closed his eyes. Emerson was a good kid. Smart, curious, the kind of 12-year-old who asked questions about how things worked. Camden had taught him to use power tools, helped him with math homework, shown him how to change the oil in a car. She's using him as a weapon. It looks that way. But Camden, if we do this right, we can get him out of this situation entirely. The brass rail sat on the outskirts of downtown Spokane, sandwiched between a pawn shop and a laundromat. It was the kind of bar that opened at 11 in the morning and stayed busy until the lights came on. Hazel Vernon had owned it for 6 years, and in that time, she developed a reputation for two things. She poured heavy, and she didn't tolerate bullshit. Camden found her in the back office, going over invoices with the concentration of a bomb technician. She looked up when he knocked on the doorframe. Well, hell, she said. Look what the cat dragged in. Hazel was 36, with short black hair and arms covered in tattoos that told the story of her 20s. She'd dated Camden for 2 years before he'd met Lorraine. They'd broken up without drama, remained friends without complications. I heard you were dead, she said, not looking up from her paperwork. Greatly exaggerated. Wife trade you in for a newer model. Camden stepped into the office and closed the door. Something like that. Hazel finally looked at him. Really looked. Her expression softened slightly. You look like hell. Feel worse. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Camden sat down, noticing the way she studied him. Hazel had always been good at reading people. It was part of what made her a successful bar owner. What do you need? She asked. Information. You hear things in here. People talk. About what? Lorraine. Her boyfriend. What people are saying about me disappearing. Hazel leaned back in her chair. You sure you want to know? Yes. Story going around is that you took off overseas and never came back. Left her with bills and a kid to raise. She paused. People felt sorry for her. Past tense. New boyfriend's kind of tool. Flashy. Acts like he owns the place everywhere he goes. Rubs people the wrong way. Camden thought about Asher standing in the doorway of his house, wearing his clothes. What else? He's been asking around about you. Wanted to know if you had friends in town who might cause trouble. Trouble for who? For him. Hazel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Seems he's a little insecure about being the replacement. Camden stood up. I need a favor. Name it. Keep your ears open. If you hear anything about Lorraine or Asher, I want to know. Hazel studied him for a moment. Camden, if you want to win this thing, you have to let the truth crush her. Not your hands. Camden met her eyes. Who says I want to win? Then what do you want? Camden thought about coming home to find strangers in his house. About legal documents with forged signatures. About Emerson being told his father figure had abandoned him. Justice. Lincoln Elementary School occupied 2 city blocks of aging brick and chain-link fence, surrounded by the kind of playground equipment that had been built when safety standards were more suggestion than law. Camden remembered the place from parent-teacher conferences, sitting in tiny plastic chairs while teachers explained Emerson's progress in careful, diplomatic language. The boy had always been smart. Too smart sometimes. The kind of 12-year-old who asked uncomfortable questions and noticed details that adults prefer to keep hidden. Camden had spent hours helping him with science projects, teaching him to use basic tools, showing him how mechanical things worked and why they broke. Now Camden sat in Jules's truck across the street from the main entrance, waiting for the final bell. School let out at 3:15, and Emerson always walked home the same route through Riverside Park to avoid the busier streets, then down Maple to the house Camden had built. Except it wasn't Emerson's home anymore. According to the legal documents Lorraine had filed, she'd moved him 3 times in the past 6 months. Different apartments, different addresses, different school districts. The constant upheaval of a woman covering her tracks. At 3:20, Camden spotted him. Emerson had grown in the 7 months Camden had been gone, shooting up with the kind of awkward adolescent growth that left boys looking like strangers in their own bodies. His brown hair was longer than Camden remembered, and he carried himself with the careful awareness that came from living in a house full of tension and half-truths. Camden waited until Emerson reached the park before getting out of the truck. He approached slowly, hands visible, moving with the same careful deliberation he'd used when approaching potentially unstable situations overseas. Emerson. The boy turned, and Camden saw the exact moment recognition hit. Emerson's eyes went wide, then narrow with confusion and something that might have been hope. "You're supposed to be dead." The words hit Camden harder than he'd expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they were delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of a kid who'd been told too many lies to trust anything completely. "Do I look dead?" Emerson approached cautiously, studying Camden's face like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. "Mom said you left us, that you went overseas and decided not to come back." Camden pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, thick with printed documents and photographs. "I brought you something." Emerson took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. He'd learned caution from somewhere, the kind of wariness that came from adults who said one thing and did another. "What is it?" "Pictures. From Turkey. Proof that I never left you." The boy opened the envelope carefully, examining each document with the methodical attention Camden had taught him when they'd worked on projects together. Inside were printed emails with timestamps, photos of Camden working on earthquake recovery sites, copies of his work contracts with the NGO, all of them dated and verified, proving that Camden had been exactly where he'd said he'd be, doing exactly what he'd said he'd do. "I sent emails," Camden said quietly, watching Emerson study the evidence. "I tried to call every few days when I could get to a computer or find a working phone line. I never got through." Emerson looked up from the papers, and Camden saw something in his eyes that reminded him of himself at that age. The careful wariness of someone who'd learned that the people who were supposed to protect you couldn't always be trusted. "These are real." "Yes, but Mom said you just disappeared. That you sent one email saying you were leaving and then nothing." Camden felt something cold settle in his chest. "She showed you an email?" "Yeah, it was short. Just said you decided to stay overseas and that we shouldn't try to contact you." "Emerson, I never sent that email." The boy studied Camden's face, looking for signs of deception the way kids learned to do when their world became unreliable. "Then who did?" "Someone who wanted you to believe I abandoned you." Emerson folded the papers carefully and put them back in the envelope. When he looked up again, there were tears in his eyes that he was trying hard not to shed. "I knew something was wrong. The email didn't sound like you. You never call me kid the way it was written, and you would have said goodbye properly." Camden knelt down, so he was at eye level with the boy. "I would never leave you without saying goodbye. Not ever. But why would Mom lie? Because she wanted me gone, and she needed you to believe it was my choice." Emerson wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture making him look younger than 12. "She's going to be mad if she finds out I talked to you. Then don't tell her." "Not yet." "When?" Camden looked at the boy he'd helped raise for 3 years, thinking about all the lies that had been told and all the damage that had been done. Emerson deserved better than broken adults and fractured families, but he also deserved the truth. "When you're ready to ask questions that she can't answer." Camden registered the domain name anonymously, using a VPN and a prepaid credit card Jules had bought for him. The blog design was simple black text on a white background, no fancy graphics, nothing that would distract from the message that he called it a man erased. The first post went live at midnight on a Tuesday. Camden had written and rewritten it a dozen times, stripping away every unnecessary word until only the facts remained. 7 months ago, I left Spokane to work earthquake recovery in Turkey. I came home to find my wife had moved another man into the house I built with my own hands. She'd filed a missing person report while I was still overseas, used forged documents to steal my identity, and had me declared legally dead. This is my story. These are her lies. Everything I'm about to show you can be verified through public records. Below the text, Camden posted scanned copies of everything. The forged signatures, the fake addresses, the fraudulent court filings. He included his work contract from Turkey, time-stamped emails, and photos proving he'd been overseas the entire time Lorraine claimed he was missing. The blog post was 2,000 words of methodical, devastating documentation. Camden hit publish and called Savannah. "It's live," he said. "Camden, what's live?" "The evidence. All of it. Public record now." There was silence on the other end of the phone. "What did you do?" "I posted everything online. Blog format. Easy to read. Impossible to dispute." "You couldn't have waited?" "We were building a legal case." "We still are. This just levels the playing field." Camden could hear Savannah typing on her computer. After a moment, she whistled low. "This is comprehensive and true. Camden, this is going to destroy her." Camden thought about Lorraine standing in his doorway, calm and composed while he was arrested for trespassing in his own home. "Good." Savannah was quiet for a moment. "I'll call my contact at the fraud office. Push them to open an official investigation. If this evidence is as solid as it looks it is, then she's done." Camden closed his laptop and looked out the window of Jules's spare room. Somewhere across town, Lorraine was sleeping in his bed, in his house with another man. But for the first time since he'd come home, Camden felt like he was winning. The truth was a weapon, and he'd just loaded it. The subpoena arrived at Lorraine's workplace on a Thursday morning. Camden knew because Hazel called him 20 minutes after it was delivered. "Friend of mine works at the law firm downtown," Hazel said. "Says some process server just hit your wife's office. Whatever you did, it's working." Camden was at the library, documenting the newest comments on his blog. The story had been shared nearly 1,000 times in 3 days. Local news outlets were starting to pick it up. "What about Asher?" "That's the interesting part. Turns out your replacement has some problems of his own. Insurance company's been looking into some claims he filed last year. Seems he might have been a little creative with his paperwork." Camden felt something cold and satisfied settle in his chest. "What kind of claims?" "Fire damage to his gym. Claimed somebody torched the place, but the investigation found accelerant patterns that suggested an inside job. He burned down his own business. Looks that way. Collected insurance money and used it to buy new equipment. Except now they want their money back." Camden thought about Asher standing in his doorway, acting like he owned the place. The irony wasn't lost on him. His phone buzzed with a text from Savannah. "County Fraud Office opened official investigation. Lorraine's been subpoenaed. Also, Child Services wants to talk about Emerson's custody situation." Camden called her back immediately. "What's happening with Emerson?" "School officials got suspicious when they saw your blog. Started asking questions about who has legal custody. Turns out Lorraine's been claiming dependency benefits for him using your social security number, but she never had legal adoption papers." Camden felt his throat tighten. "Where is he now?" "Emergency placement with me. Temporary, until they sort out the legal issues." "Is he okay?" "He's scared. Confused." "But Camden, he brought something with him. That envelope you gave him. He told the social worker everything." Camden closed his eyes. He'd known this would be hard on Emerson, but there hadn't been another way. "Can I see him?" "Not yet, but soon. The investigation is moving fast now." Camden wrote the letter by hand, using the same careful penmanship he'd learned in the Army. Clear, precise, impossible to misinterpret. He had it delivered to Lorraine's attorney's office by certified mail. Signature required. "Lorraine, you have 2 choices. 1. Confess and walk with half your dignity. 2. Keep lying and lose everything. The fraud investigation is real. The evidence is public. Your boyfriend's insurance problems are about to become criminal charges. You have 48 hours to decide." Camden, he didn't sign it with love. He didn't ask how she was doing. He didn't mention Emerson or the house or the 3 years he'd helped raise a boy who wasn't his biological son, but whom he'd loved anyway. The letter was exactly what it appeared to be, an ultimatum. Camden drove to the post office himself and watched the clerk stamp the envelope. He'd given Lorraine a choice, which was more than she'd given him. The 48 hours passed in silence that Camden's second blog post went live on a Sunday morning. This one was shorter, but more devastating. He titled it The Full Timeline. Instead of just documenting the fraud, he created a minute-by-minute reconstruction of Lorraine's scheme. Bank records showing when she'd started redirecting his mail. Phone logs proving she'd received his calls from overseas, but never returned them. Credit card statements showing purchases for home renovations while she was claiming financial hardship. Most damaging was the handwritten confession from Savannah, notarized and witnessed, detailing every fraudulent document she'd examined. As a licensed legal consultant, Savannah's professional opinion carried weight in court. But the real bombshell was buried in the middle of the post. Camden had found something in his old paperwork that even Savannah had missed. The original marriage license Lorraine had filed 9 years ago contained signatures that didn't match either of their driver's licenses from that time period. She'd been forging documents from the very beginning. The blog post ended with a simple statement. The Spokane County Sheriff's Office has opened a criminal investigation into identity theft, fraud, and perjury. All evidence has been turned over to prosecutors. The courtroom in Spokane County was smaller than Camden had expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly green and outdated, wood paneling that suggested the space had been decorated sometime in the 70s and never updated. Camden sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, watching as his former wife, he reminded himself, was led in wearing orange county jail scrubs. Lorraine looked smaller than he remembered. 7 months of legal proceedings and mounting evidence had worn her down, leaving her with the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who'd finally run out of lies to tell. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and without makeup she looked older, more fragile. The charges were read with mechanical precision. Identity theft in the first degree, fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Each count carried potential prison time. Each count was supported by evidence that Camden had spent months collecting and documenting. How does the defendant plead? Judge Martinez asked that Lorraine's attorney, a tired-looking public defender who'd clearly drawn the short straw, stood up. Guilty, Your Honor. My client wishes to enter a guilty plea to all charges. Camden felt no satisfaction in the moment. Justice, he'd learned, was a cold thing that left you empty rather than vindicated. The proceeding took less than an hour. Lorraine was sentenced to 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by 5 years of probation and full restitution of stolen funds. She would repay every dollar she'd taken, plus interest and court costs, as the bailiff led her away. Lorraine turned and looked directly at Camden for the first time since his arrest 8 months ago. There was no apology in her eyes, no remorse. Just a flat acknowledgement that she'd gambled and lost. Camden watched her disappear through a side door and felt nothing at all. Later that afternoon, he drove to the house one final time. The for sale sign had been replaced with a sold banner, and moving trucks were loading the last of the furniture he decided not to keep. Everything else, the couch where Lorraine had sat with Asher, the bed they'd shared, the kitchen table where they'd eaten dinner and pretended to be a family, would go to new owners who didn't know the history embedded in every room. Camden walked through the empty spaces, his footsteps echoing off walls he'd painted himself. The house felt smaller without furniture, like a shell that had been hollowed out and prepared for demolition. In the master bedroom, he found a single photograph tucked behind a baseboard that the movers had missed at. It was a picture of him and Emerson from 2 years ago, taken during a camping trip to Lake Coeur d'Alene. They were both grinning at the camera, covered in mud from setting up their tent in the rain. Camden had taught the boy how to tie proper knots that weekend, how to build a fire that would last through the night, how to read the sky for weather changes. He pocketed the photograph and walked outside, where the moving truck was pulling away with the last remnants of his old life. The moving truck pulled away on a gray Tuesday morning, taking the last pieces of furniture Camden wanted to salvage. Everything else, the couch where Lorraine had sat with Asher, the bed they'd shared, the kitchen table where they'd eaten dinner like a normal family, would go to auction. Camden stood in the empty living room, listening to his footsteps echo off walls he'd painted himself. The house felt smaller without furniture, like a shell that had been hollowed out and left to decay. Camden, he turned to find Emerson standing in the doorway. The boy looked older than 12, wearing clothes that were too big for him and carrying a backpack covered in patches. Savannah said I could come say goodbye. Camden nodded. To the house. To you. They stood in the empty room, surrounded by memories neither of them wanted to claim. Where will you go? Emerson asked. I'm building a cabin. Outside town. Got some land near the river. Will you have room for visitors? Camden looked at the boy he'd helped raise, thinking about all the lies that had been told and all the damage that had been done. Emerson deserved better than broken adults and fractured families. But he also deserved the truth. You were the only one who told me the truth, Emerson said quietly. Camden thought about that for a moment. That's all I'll ever owe you. It wasn't a promise of visits or phone calls or attempts to maintain a relationship that had been built on someone else's lies. It was something simpler and more honest, an acknowledgement that they'd both been victims of the same deception. Emerson nodded like he understood. Will you be okay? Will you? Savannah's nice. She makes good pancakes. Better than mine. Don't push it. Camden almost smiled. Almost. They walked out of the empty house together. Camden locked the door for the last time and handed the keys to the real estate agent who was waiting by her car in the driveway. Emerson hugged him awkwardly, the way kids do when they're not sure if affection is allowed. Camden hugged him back, briefly, then watched him walk to Savannah's car as they drove away. Camden looked at the house one more time. It was just wood and lies now, ready to be someone else's problem. He drove Jules's truck toward the mountains, where a piece of land waited for him to build something new, something honest, something that belonged to him alone. In the rearview mirror, the house faded from view, becoming just another structure in a town full of people pretending their lives made sense. Camden didn't look back again. 6 months later, Camden's cabin sat on 20 acres of pine forest, 15 miles outside Spokane. He'd built it himself, using hand tools and patience, taking the time to get every joint perfect. The metal workshop beside it was smaller than his old garage, but it was enough that he made custom metalwork, now gates, railings, decorative pieces for people who wanted something built to last. The work paid well enough, and he didn't have to answer to anyone but himself. Emerson visited sometimes on weekends when Savannah drove up with groceries and stayed for dinner. The boy was doing well in his new school, making friends, learning to trust adults again. Lorraine was serving 18 months in minimum security, followed by 5 years of probation and restitution payments. She'd been ordered to repay every dollar she'd stolen, plus interest and court costs. Asher had fled to Oregon when the insurance charges were filed. Last Camden heard, he was working construction under a different name. Camden never asked about either of them. They were part of a life he'd left behind, like the house he'd sold and the marriage that had never been legal to begin with. The final twist had come during the trial. Lorraine's attorney, desperate for any defense, had produced the original marriage license from 9 years earlier. Under forensic examination, it proved to be a forgery. Lorraine had never been Camden's legal wife. She'd forged their marriage certificate to claim spousal benefits while he was deployed overseas, using his military ID and personal information to establish false documentation. Camden had never been married. He'd never been divorced. He'd never owed her anything at all. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent months proving she betrayed him, only to discover that betrayal required a relationship that had never legally existed. He'd never had to forgive her, because she'd never been his to forgive. On quiet evenings, Camden sat on his cabin's porch and listened to the river that ran through his property. The water was constant, always moving, always finding the easiest path around obstacles. He was learning to be like the water, patient, persistent, unwilling to fight what couldn't be changed, but always moving forward. The past was gone. The future was his to build, and this time he'd build it right.